Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our November 16th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode is part 3 of our special 3-part series with 3 Midwestern Farm Bureau economists: Iowa Farm Bureau Senior Economist Dr. Sam Funk, Nebraska Farm Bureau Senior Economist Jay Rempe, and Illinois Farm Bureau Senior Economist Mike Doherty. Sam, Jay, and Mike got together for a virtual meeting late in October to discuss economic insights and future projections for their respective states. We recorded the audio from that meeting and split it into 3 parts. We released part 1 on November 9th and part 2 on November 12th. Of course, we're releasing part 3 today, and you can find the entire series on iowafarmbureau.com/podcast or in your favorite podcast app. Part 1 dealt with farm income conditions in Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois, farm credit conditions, government assistance, the international trade environment, and more. Part 2 got into the changing nature of farm production, ownership, and management, along with other topics like the impact of COVID-19. And today, in our final installment of the series, our economists will wrap things up with a discussion about farm demographics, the impact of consumer and farmland owner preferences on farming practices, and how the next generation of farmers is changing things up. So here we go. Spokesman editor Dirk Steimel kicks off the discussion in part 3 of our Midwestern Farm Economist series.
Jay, what's the farm population look like there in Nebraska? Is it changing, and how is that affecting farmers?
Yeah, it's definitely changing as we move through time. We're gradually, the farm population in Nebraska, and I'm sure it's happening in Illinois and Iowa too, is growing older. I think in the last census, the average age was about 56 years. And when you look at the number of younger farmers involved, it's fairly stable over the last few years anyway, from some of the data I've looked at. Interestingly, though, and this kind of touches on a point that Mike brought up earlier, when you look at the total number of operators or producers that are active in the farming operations, it's staying fairly stable. And so that tells me what's happening is what Mike said earlier, is that we're seeing the number of farms are decreasing, but we're seeing these larger farmers, there's multi-generational family farms, a lot of more people active in the farming operation. So things are changing. We're going to see a transition over the next 10 or 15 years from one generation, that, as everybody knows, from one generation to the next. What really struck me is I read something the other day about how the different generations view things, from millennials to Generation X and the like. And it really got me to thinking as farm economists and farm organizations, what those folks, as we move through the next the next couple generations, what they're going to demand of us. And because they value different things, they're looking for different things. They are much more embracing of technologies. They are putting them on their operations. They want to interact that way. And so we're going to see a big change. And one of the things that in terms of the demographics and changing that we're seeing is a lot of these farms, as they transition, the ownership stays within a family, but that ownership doesn't necessarily live on the farm or the ranch. And so I'll term them as non-ag ownership. And so we're going to have this much more of folks that are outside of agriculture owning the assets, but the operators on the ground are going to be leasing the assets. They're going to be bringing the equipment. They're going to be bringing the marketing expertise and all the other production expertise to bear on that. And so that we're going to see that changing over time. And I think it's going to accelerate here in the near future.
So in Iowa, and we've got the Iowa State University CARD group who did a survey on farmland ownership. And one of the fastest growing age categories for those owning farmland is over 74. And if you think about a more senior generation owning that ground, and they may have an affinity for that ground, maybe they farmed it, maybe they're still farming it because we're healthier, living longer, being able to do more. But at the same time, there's that question of when does that ground shift and how does that ground shift? I mean, we're still seeing very strong returns right now. Before we had this increase in prices for corn and soybeans, we probably were looking at a lot more farm families who were no longer living on the farm who thought about selling that land in order to be able to achieve a certain amount out of it, because they might have been seeing downward pressure on cash rental rates. All of a sudden, when you get soybeans above $10 and you get corn up there closer to $4, there may not be quite that downward pressure on cash rental rates across the state. And so that might give you somewhat of a slowdown for what people may have been thinking about doing for selling those agricultural land assets. So I think that's important for us to think about just exactly how is this ownership and control of agricultural ground and the farms that some of the non-owner operators might be engaged with. And when you look across Iowa, those who own all of the ground that they farm tend to be, at least for acres wise, the smaller farms. They might be a lifestyle farm, whatever the case may be. Those who tend to be the larger size crop farms own a little bit of ground and lease ground as well. So, it's an important aspect to look at those changing dynamics of what's occurring, which also leads us somewhat into the what different needs do those groups have. And I think you hit on something there, Jay, for what kind of information flow will this next generation of farmer have? And frankly, not just the next generation of farmer, what about the next generation consumer and what they will demand from these farms for what they want to see with the amount of information, with the production practices, with a number of different factors that come up with how farms interact with society, not just through the product, but through that farm's very existence.
Sam, you've opened up a big chest there of different questions and issues. I just like to add to those. So yes, you brought some very good points. One is the growth in the conservation addendums being attached to farm leases for farmland. I don't know if you're seeing that over in Iowa, but that's a sign of the times. These millennials, as they become landowners, are wanting these long-term conservation practices take place on the farmland that they're renting out to a farmer. And as you know, at least here at Illinois, our leasing system is all year to year predominantly. So we've got kind of a collision of values there. We got a farmer looking year to year at how much he can afford or she can afford to pay in cash rent. And you've got the landowner progressively moving into a square of looking at some very long-term environmental benefits they want to lock that renter into. So somebody's got to give there. And the other thing or there's going to be a tug of war here of values. And I think the other one, not to say the farmers don't have the value of conservation, but they have a different time frame, a time horizon based on these lease lengths. So something looks to me like it's got to change on the length of these leases if we're going to move toward a more environmental and conservation determined form of leasing farmland. The other thing, as you've mentioned, is about the cash rental and the rental rates in general. In central Illinois, a lot of people don't realize we have as counties that 85% of the crop acreage is rented by the farmer. Only 15% is owned. And there's a high degree of competitiveness between farmers to rent that crop acreage. So they're reluctant to tell a landowner, I'm sorry, I just cannot afford that level of rent, or especially if it's on cash rent, because they're afraid somebody might outbid them. And so as a result, we end up with this high cost of production we're locked into here. And I'm waiting for that. So at some point, it seems like somebody's got to blink. And what happened this fall as farmers began the negotiation season with landowners over their cash rental rates, what happened? We had high soybean prices and we had those ad hoc payments. So once again, in a way, the can got kicked down the road and we ended up with no decrease in land prices and no decrease in cash rental rates. But one of these years, we're going to have a collision, I think, where we're going to end up with very low farm income, and we will have already locked in that year to some pretty high cash rental rates. That's a concern I have.
So Mike, when you talk about, that they go year to year with these cash rental contracts, and we do as well. There's a certain time when you have to, if you're going to get out of that cash rental agreement, that you've got to do it, early enough. They've got opportunity to flex into that next year. But it's important that we think about the opportunities that we may have now, and not just the challenges that, maybe some of these recent prices are going to support cash flow rates, but maybe this is an opportunity to go in and start talking about a flexible rental arrangement where that cash rent might alter based on what the returns are for the following year. Or maybe it's that as we think about these conservation protocols that need to be, or that are desired to be put in place by the owners, that we start to think about some sort of a share agreement again, with them helping to fund those practices they want in place, because they know it will remain with the farm. Maybe they help to benefit the farm for being able to keep, soil in place. Maybe they're helping for, managing some of the water runoff. A lot of different factors that come into place. But this may be the perfect opportunity to be able to try to get those alternative lease structures in place. When we talk about agriculture and production agriculture being so much more complex with the level of technology, with precision planning, maybe it's time that we get somewhat more complex in our flexible rental agreements, so that we are able to manage our way with a period of changing prices for our commodities, and for the potential higher cost for some of those practices that are desired to be in place, that the landowner may desire to be in there, that's not necessarily in the operator's immediate benefit. So I think there's an opportunity to build in there and to look for that flexibility as well.
Sam, that's an excellent point, because I think we're in Nebraska, we're starting to see a bit of that creep in a little bit. At least what I'm hearing anecdotally from some of our members and talking to some of our folks is that they're starting to work with the landowners to provide a little flexibility in those lease agreements. And like what you guys already said, we're largely year to year, and a lot of those are verbal as well. There's not a whole lot in writing either. And so they're going from year to year, but I think we're starting to see a little more structure around it, a little more flexibility. One of the things, oddly, in Nebraska that I understand is driving a bit of this is our property tax situation, because we've seen those climb very rapidly over a short period of time, few years back, and so that's driving a little bit of that. And so I think we're seeing some of that. I'd be curious. I had not heard, Mike, about the tying to the lease agreements, any of the conservation measures, but I'd just be curious. One of the things that I am hearing a little bit here in Nebraska is, because of what you said earlier, Sam, is the consumers are demanding more transparency, more sustainability, that we're seeing through some of the marketing channels work back into demands of the producers that things be produced in a certain way, and can you verify that and provide some data to show that it was produced in that fashion. And I see that. I know sometimes we worry about the government regulating certain conservation practices or ways of doing things. I almost see some of those things happening, but it's coming through the marketing channels and not the government. I'm just curious if you guys are seeing the same things.
Well, we have seen those types of pressures coming through for various marketing channels. So we saw Unilever have a large push for certain environmental practices and sustainability measures that they put into place. I mean, when you look at some of our larger scale agriculture companies, our input suppliers who now have a corporate sustainability officer and several people who work in those types of offices, they see that there's this growing push from the consumer side. In fact, it'll be December 1 here of 2020 that the Chicago Federal Reserve is going to have an online event where they're going to talk about some of these consumer desires and through there. So I just happen to know a couple of economists who are going to be participating in that event. So that's growing in regards to the fact that there is stronger consumer sentiment. If you think about in the United States, when we talk about COVID, where we might have had these significant drops in economic activity and GDP, I mean, to the tunes of, double-digit percentage decreases, and then globally you had single-digit decreases, and it's like, well, okay, shouldn't they still be able? No, when you talk about a single-digit decrease and you're barely able to come up with enough money to eat, you just want to eat, and a couple of pennies a day can mean the difference between my belly was full and my belly was not full. And so when you think about some of those changes, they don't have. Maybe they would rather that something was grown in a certain way. They're more concerned about, can they eat? Did they have enough to actually put on the plate for their family that day? So I think we've got a very strong market, a very strong marketplace, but there's a reason that demand is used in two ways: the economic demand of what somebody wants and the I demand something else. And if you're able to vote with your dollars, then that's a question. Are your dollars going to support somebody to be able to take on potentially what could be a higher production cost activity to be able to provide you that level of food that you're looking for?
Mike, you've got a big city over there in Illinois, in Chicago. Are you seeing that kind of pressure from consumers over there?
I would say yes. The desire is there. In terms of it actually being implemented into for farm lease arrangements, not so much. I mean, it's starting, but it's still a very small percentage, I think, of farm leases that are affected. And that would be the way in which they could exercise that pressure or influence the most directly, was by tying it to the farm lease. As far as the consumer goes, remember, our corn and soybeans largely goes to feed livestock, or on the corn side, livestock and ethanol plants. So it's all being converted through animal species and then consumed. So it does help us a little bit there to kind of I think that in some ways, maybe that dilutes the consumer's focus or ability to influence this, because how is the consumer consuming those products? Well, ultimately they're consuming them, but when they barbecue that prime rib out on the grill, So I don't know how they could really have that much influence, except through maybe as active shareholders of some of these agricultural companies. I don't know.
We're also seeing some different management strategies on farms today as younger generations come in and they're trying new things. What kind of strategies are you seeing in your areas? Jay, we'll start with you.
As the younger generation comes in, I'm seeing a lot of operations looking at ways to look at new enterprises for the farm operation. Not just rely so heavily on the corn soybean rotation or the cattle operation, or they're looking for different ways to add value on the farm or ranch, and then maybe market a little bit some directly to the consumer. And then I think one of the things that a lot of farmers are talking about right now is do we continue to try to produce a homogeneous commodity like corn and soybeans or cattle? And if so, then we've got to adopt some management strategies to be the low-cost producer out there in order to compete. Or are we going to look at something like we were just talking about, if the consumers are demanding something like an organic product or some other kind of attribute to that, are we willing to put in the infrastructure and the cost structure, and as Sam said, at the higher cost, really, to produce that and try to meet that market? So I think a lot of those different kinds of management strategies are going on now. The other thing I see is a lot of turning to thinking about managing the farming operation or the ranching operation as a business, and thinking about it in terms of managing human resources and liabilities and risk management and all those kind of things. I think we're just the trends to the larger operations, the multi-generational, you're getting more people involved. They're looking at all those kinds of different issues that they have to manage for now, that whereas if they were sole proprietorship, or if they were smaller, didn't have to worry about that so much a few years back.
Sam, same question for you. Different management strategies you're seeing here in Iowa?
So I think it's a multi-pronged aspect. You've got some who are looking at, if you will, thinking about some of the traditional ways of having a diversified operation, maybe that they can find some way to be able to achieve higher returns from it. Maybe they're looking at setting up a bed and breakfast that overlooks a dairy parlor. We're continuing to see new and inventive ways that producers are looking for trying to achieve higher returns. Maybe they're looking at direct marketing to consumers with some of the foodstuffs, and that's very difficult off of a, if you will, a modern agricultural production enterprise to be able to do that kind of direct marketing with that kind of aspect. Now, that being said, there are those who do it. We don't have a Chicago, but we've got our own set of those strong areas that have direct marketing to consumers available to us, and we can try to focus in on those. You find a lot who are looking at a way to try to achieve some sort of a benefit with sustainability criteria. Maybe they're looking at the alternatives for how do we get into a system which will pay us for sequestering carbon. There are those opportunities that have availed themselves, and we're aware of, obviously, some of the bigger brand names now that are establishing themselves, and those things can change with policies, and those opportunities can change with consumer desires. Maybe we align ourselves as being more preferred producers because of certain aspects we've got, and sometimes it's just because I happen to be close enough to a demand center, and if that ethanol plant's operating, I've got a place to go with my corn that I can get 10 cents higher than anybody else. And that's important to think about all those operations. But I think you find that just with the technology, and we've got that next generation. I mean, how many of us have said that, my 2-year-old knows how to run that TV remote better than I do now? So it's kind of the same thing now where, when I speak with the younger generations, I talk about the things that they can probably do because of their experience on a computer and how that technology will shift and enable them to do more things in certain regards. There are risks and rewards that are a potential all the way through many of these decisions. And I think part of what we need to do and what we try to provide is some sort of service to look at some of these alternatives for what they can mean, even if it's bringing together a group of people to hear some of these various alternatives that are available to them. And I think sometimes it's just learning more about them and hearing from it from a credible system or somebody who has experience being in those systems. And I think that's one of the greatest things I've been able to do is to hear from farmers who have been engaging with some of these activities and what are their experiences, because that's part of that best learning activity is what somebody's already been able to go through, and they know some of the pitfalls, so they know some of the advantages through those systems.
Well, as we wrap up, that's a kind of a good place to go. What's the role of Farm Bureau economist in this changing time and kind of a turbulent market? And how do you see that role? Mike, you want to start us off?
Well, monthly, I advise our board of directors and also internal staff specialists and committees on what's the status of farm income in Illinois and what's the outlook. I provide a heads up, basically, if there's trouble on the horizon in a particular part of the state or with a particular section of the industry, a strata of the industry, whether it be generational or be the livestock versus grain production. That's one area in which I serve the Farm Bureau in my state. And then also as kind of a go-to person when people ask the questions that don't come up all that often, but people need an answer to regarding economics and the sources of information and the kind of research bases that are out there, to provide that insight based on that information from other economists. To a large extent, I act as a connector for Illinois Farm Bureau with the economists at University of Illinois, so that I can just communicate with them. The Farm Doc team, which is excellent at University of Illinois, we're blessed. All our states are blessed with our land grant universities and our extension economists, and I find myself acting as a conduit, getting that information, refining the question, and then providing the answer back to our decision makers.
Jay, how about you? How do you see your role?
So part of my role is what Mike mentioned as being a connector, I think, between some of the academic and the research and things that are done in the ag economic field. I view a little bit as a translator. You have the academic side of things that speak a little different language than you do our farmers and ranchers and our members. So I try to translate some of the research and the work that's done at our universities and bring that to our farmers and rancher members so they can know what's happening, be on the edge of some of the research, because I do think there's some value there on some of that research. The other thing I try to do is inform some of the decision making we make as an organization and our elected Farm Bureau leaders make in both the policy development process and the policy implementation process. I try to bring resources and information to that, so when they make a decision on a policy, they are informed in that regards. And then when we're trying to implement it, I obviously try to add some data and some statistics that help it make our argument and to our elected leaders. And then the last thing I try to do a little bit, and this relates back to what Mike and Sam were talking about earlier about what the markets are telling folks to do right now in terms of selling grains and soybeans. But I play a little bit as devil's advocate. I try to get our members and our staff to look at the underlying trends. What's the market doing? What's the market trying to tell them? And use that in their decision making and try to help them, give them the information that they need to have sustainable operations.
Sam, we'll close with you.
Well, and obviously we are blessed with a very strong team, both here in the state and then our surrounding states and at AFBF. So part of what we try to do here is to really just bring that information that's available and try to synthesize it into, so what does that mean for an Iowa farmer or Iowa farm family and our Iowa economy? I mean, at the end of the day, what we're trying to be is that resource for our members, so they've got that information clear. I mean, when we think about all the information that's out there, I mean, you've got a lot of free information on the internet. You've got just tremendous volumes of information from USDA and other government sources. And it's almost impossible to have anybody, any group, much less a single person, to understand and to synthesize all that information. What we try to do is to try to get the most relevant information that is applicable for our Iowa producers directly brought to bear for them so that they can synthesize it quickly. I mean, Dirk, we think about the information that comes out from the Spokesman, or in this case, the Spokesman Speaks podcast out through there. And there's so many different venues that we try to take place to bring up the information so that people can grab it and are ready to consume format out through here. And I'm very thankful for Mike and Mike Doherty from the Illinois Farm Bureau and for Jay Rempe from the Nebraska Farm Bureau joining us here in Iowa. And I hope that this material will be useful for our producers here in Iowa, but also for those in Illinois and Nebraska who are able to try to gather some of that information and just to know where do we go for a lot of information. You've heard us say a lot about the Federal Reserve Bank, and there's a lot of information that comes directly from there. The Kansas City Fed has an Omaha branch, and so there's a lot of information that's available to producers through that area as well, and very talented economists, at least one of which was actually an Iowa State grad who's over there at Omaha. So got to put the plug in for Dr. Nathan Kaufman over there. But there is a lot of information out through there, and I think it's important that we're available and the producers know that when those questions come up, we'll try to get information back to them in a lot of different formats. So while this world looks a whole lot different as we're going through COVID, and then hopefully as we're out of COVID, I mean, that's my hope and prayer. But at the same time, we're going to try to provide all the information we can so that producers can look at the opportunities and understand the environment they're in.
Plenty of information to consider, and a good reminder that Farm Bureau and its economists at the state and national levels are here to help farmers make sense of changing conditions to make the best decision for their respective farms. We hope that you enjoyed this 3-part podcast series. And again, I'd like to remind you that this podcast series is a precursor for an economic webinar series that Iowa Farm Bureau will be offering farmers in 2021. So if you're interested to hear more insights from leading economists in Iowa and around the country, you'll want to stay tuned for that. Of course, we'll be sharing more information with you about that webinar series through the Spokesman newspaper, this podcast, and iowafarmbureau.com as we inch closer to 2021. With that, we'll wrap up this episode of the podcast. I'd like to conclude this episode by offering a sincere thank you to our participating economists, Sam Funk, Jay Rempe, and Mike Doherty, for taking time to share their expertise and perspective with us. We truly appreciate that. And we'd like to thank you, our podcast listeners, for following along through the series, including our friends in Nebraska and Illinois. If you enjoyed the series, we hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and catch our next episode on November 30th. Your work to strengthen agriculture across the Midwest and throughout our entire country inspires all that we do here, and we'd like to thank you for that work and thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.